So we'll continue our discussion with the male external genitalia with the penis, which is the organ that passes underneath the pubic symphysis and is a tubular organ that has three erectile bodies that are called the corpora cavernosa on the dorsal surface and the corpus spongiosum underneath it that has the urethra running through it. And it has two main functions, one of which is to conduct urine to the exterior when the person voids, and the other is for the introduction of seminal fluids into the female reproductive tract during coitus. So the penis has three parts. The root, and that's the part that fixes it to the body wall. And we'll see that the corpora cavernosa will have these parts that adhere to the ischial rami of the pelvic area. So they will adhere to the ischial rami and form what's called the crura of the penis. Each one is the crust of the penis. And we will also have the body shaft, and that the two corpora cavernosae on the external part of the penis that will be on the dorsal surface, along with our corpus spongiosum that has the urethra running through it, that will be inferior to the corpora cavernosae. And it is the tip of this corpus spongiosum that's going to expand at the tip of the penis and create the glands, which is the distal part. So if we look at it in transverse section here, we can see, or I'm sorry, this is coronal section. So if we look in coronal section, here we have our two corpora cavernosae, and part of it will curve back around and be adhered to the the ischial rami, and the pubic symphysis will be, if this was a organism, the pubic symphysis would be about right here. And then we're going to have our corpus spongiosum, which is going to be underneath the two upper layers of the corpora cavernosae, which are quite a bit larger. And the corpus spongiosum, as we see, expands down into this glands here. There's what is going to have the urethra pass through it, and what we call that spongy urethra. And we also have a piece of skin that covers the glands called the prepuce. And it is in this area here that a waxy substance called smegma is made. And so smegma can harbor bacteria and predispose someone to infection or even possibly cancer. So a lot of people remove the prepuce during circumcision, usually early in life, sometimes later in life, but most humans have this removed. And in other animals, such as horses, for example, a buildup of smegma can cause a problem, and that if you look at other animals, they have a sheath into which the penis can retract, and sometimes a buildup of smegma can cause adhesions, and so the penis kind of gets stuck in the sheath. So that's another reason that smegma, if it builds up too much, can be a problem, and sometimes veterinarians actually have to come and clean it out. All right, so let's look in transverse section now. So here we have a little plane that's going to show us how we're going to cut this coronal section now into transverse section, and now we can see the layers of the penis. We have the skin on the outside, then we're going to have the dartos muscle, which is going to be continuous with the dartos muscle of the scrotum. Under that, we're going to have a layer of areolar connective tissue. This is going to be very important so that as this organ expands and moves, that the skin doesn't get stuck and kind of inhibited or limited in any way. So this is the dorsal surface here. These are the two corpora cavernosa sitting on top, and they're basically blood vessels with some connective tissue partitions between them. And we've got these blood vessels that when the penis becomes erect, there will be blood. The blood vessels will dilate, and blood will aggregate into these erectile tissues. So we've got the two corpora cavernosa on the dorsal surface and the corpus spongiosum here. So corpus spongiosum simply means spongy body, and corpora cavernosae just simply means cavernous bodies. All right, so as we've said before, we've got a layer of smooth muscle right under the skin called the dartos muscle. It is a continuation of the dartos that we saw in the scrotum. And basically this is what can give the skin, the overlying skin, a crinkly appearance. Now, obviously, the skin has to be able to accommodate shifts in position and change and all this kind of thing. So that's why we have this areolar connective tissue underlying it that allows the skin to move freely. All right, the prepuce, as we've already talked about, that sort of covers the glands of the penis. It's usually removed in circumcision, and that's to prevent a buildup of smegma and infection. And here we can see it in the lateral view. So here we have our corpora cavernosi. Here we can see how they each form a crus. Crura is the plural of that, and the crus is basically this part of the corpus cavernosum that is going to adhere to that ischial ramus here. And so this is the crus of the penis, and then we also have the bulb of the penis up here, and that's formed by where the spongy corpus spongiosum will start. And here we have the glands, which is basically an expansion of the corpus spongiosum at the tip of the penis. And then we can see the external urethra orifice, which is through what? The urethra. This is where the urethra ends. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the erectile tissue. That's deep to the areolar connective tissue. It's mostly elastic fibers that are going to encircle a network of blood vessels. And so we're going to have a lot of blood vessels, vascular channels that are going to be sort of held together in this elastic connective tissue network. And nitric oxide, which you probably will recall, which is one of the things that dilates smooth muscle, that's going to dilate the smooth muscle of the, or I should say dilates blood vessels. So it relaxes the smooth muscle and that dilates the blood vessels. That allows blood flow in there. And then as long as the blood flow is in there and retained in these erectile bodies, then the organ will be erect. All right, we've already talked about the two corpora cavernosi. We talked about the corpus spongiosum already. So let's talk a little bit about the hormones that we see in the male reproductive system. We've already touched on them before, and we've touched on them in the endocrine chapter as well. So we have got, as you recall, we've got two hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. Those, in turn, are stimulated to be released by gonadotropin-releasing hormone that is released from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which will in turn cause the anterior pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone, which is going to promote the maturation of sperm. So basically, follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate sperm development. And then we have luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone gets its name from the fact that it was first discovered in the female reproductive system, and it basically causes the luteal body to arise. And we'll talk about that when we get into the female reproductive system. But before this hormone was actually characterized as what the structure was, it was not known that it was the same hormone in males and females, and it had a different name in males until they realized it was the same hormone. So they just called it luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone is going to cause the male reproductive tract to produce androgens and male reproductive hormones. All right, so our gonadotropin-releasing hormone, as you recall, is synthesized in the hypothalamus. And here's the thing. It's going to be secreted, on average, in pulses of 60 to 90 minutes. So we're going to have intervals of 60 to 90 minutes when we'll have this surge or the secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And this is going to control the rates of secretion of FSH and LH. And so these hormones in males, FSH and LH, will be fairly consistent. Now, in females, these hormones will rise and fall throughout the cycle, the reproductive cycle, the what we call the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle. And those will be very important. These hormones will be very important in regulating the timing of that cycle, whereas in males, they're released pretty continuously throughout the duration of their lifetime, and then they'd start to fall off toward the end of the male's life during what they call andropause, and we have just a general decrease of all of these hormones. And we'll see that this is one way in which the male and female reproductive systems will differ, and that is in the timing of the secretion of these hormones. All right, so FSH, which is follicle-stimulating hormone, it gets its name because it was first discovered in the female reproductive system, and it stimulates the follicle, which will promote the maturation of the oocyte. Well, in males, it does the same thing. It causes spermatic production. So Think of FSH as stimulating gamete production in either system. So follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate gamete production. In this case, it's going to target our nurse cells of the seminiferous tubules. Remember from last time, nurse cells are sometimes called Sertoli cells, but they have one other name, and that is sustentacular cells, because what they do is they are promoting the development of spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis. They will also secrete a very important protein called androgen binding protein. Now, what androgen binding protein does is it's going to concentrate testosterone in this region. So we're going to have a couple of feedback mechanisms, because as we promote spermatogenesis, which will be regulated by follicle-stimulating hormone and gonadotropin-releasing hormone, as we start producing enough gametes, then we're also going to start producing inhibin. And inhibin is a feedback hormone that is going to slow the production of FSH by the pituitary and slow the production of gonadotropin-releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. So as we have more and more spermatogenesis, then we're also going to secrete more inhibin. So inhibin, as we've said, is going to inhibit both follicle-stimulating hormone and gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So as inhibin is basically, it's going to sort of counteract FSH. So once we have elevated follicle-stimulating hormone, we're also going to increase inhibin production until our FSH returns. So this is kind of a negative feedback mechanism. And likewise, if we have low levels of follicle-stimulating hormone, then inhibin production will also fall, and then follicle-stimulating hormone will increase again. Luteinizing hormone, this is going to target the interstitial cells, which are also called the interstitial cells of Leydig of the testis, and these will produce testosterone and other androgens. Testosterone is one of the hormones that stimulates spermatogenesis. It's also going to affect libido and sexual behaviors. It stimulates metabolism, protein synthesis, red blood cell formation. It stimulates erythropoietin formation, but it also, which is one thing that estrogen doesn't. And testosterone also promotes muscle growth. Now, estrogen does too, but not in the same amount. And one thing that we will see, interestingly, when we study the female reproductive system a little bit later on, is that testosterone is actually a precursor to estrogen. So estrogen will be made from testosterone via an enzyme called aromatase. And remember, both of these are cholesterol derivatives, so they have very similar structures chemically, and so it just takes one little change to turn testosterone into estrogen. All right, testosterone is going to be one of the things that establishes the male secondary sex characteristics, and hence the name androgen. Andros meaning man, gen, creating a man. So this is what causes the typical male sexual characteristics to develop. So distribution of facial hair and the typical body characteristics of males, they have where their adipose is deposited, for example. So as males gain weight, they typically gain it around the middle and maybe on the back, whereas females gain weight in a different place. And that's partially due to the differential effects of testosterone and estrogen. And of course, testosterone is going to be important for maintaining the accessory glands and the organs of the male reproductive tract. So testosterone is a steroid hormone. So it is a derivative of cholesterol, as you recall. So that means it's lipid soluble. So it can basically diffuse across the cell membrane, where it will bind to an intracellular receptor, usually gets translated into the nucleus, and then that's going to cause upregulation of certain gene expression. And while it's in circulation, before it reaches its target, it has to be chaperoned around by some kind of protein. So usually we have two types of proteins that will chaperone around or shepherd around this testosterone. So we have gonadal steroid binding globulin, simply GBG, and that's going to carry about 2/3 of it. And the other third will be carried by albumins, which, as you recall, are proteins that are created by the liver and put into circulation. All right, testosterone is going to affect development. As we've said, we have to have that in utero burst of testosterone for the person even to develop along the male pathway. We talked earlier about the fact that we have what are called the Wolferian system, which is the male reproductive system, and the Mullerian system, which is the female reproductive system. And both of them will develop from the same embryonic structures. So if you don't get that in utero signal to develop along the male pathway, the female pathway is the default. And so genetically male people who did not get the in utero signal will often develop as phenotypically female. So their external genitalia look female, they act female, they think that they are female, and it's usually not discovered that they're genetically male until puberty, when certain cycles don't start, and then they realize, they look at them and genetically and discover, oh, these people are actually genetically male but phenotypically female. And so basically we're going to see production of testosterone around the 7th week of fetal development, and it's going to reach prenatal peak after about 6 months, and it's going to secrete something called Mullerian inhibiting factor. And this is going to be important because the Mullerian ducts will become the oviducts later on. So the Mullerian ducts, as the name implies, they're part of the female reproductive system, and so they become the oviducts later on. And so basically this Mullerian inhibiting factor is going to basically cause the regression of these ducts. So basically this early surge in testosterone is what's going to stimulate the male reproductive system develop. All right, so basically we're going to have some hypothalamic centers that are going to program male sexual behaviors. And one of the big things about the hypothalamus in males and females is how they secrete and when they secrete certain hormones. So gonadotropic releasing hormone FSH and LH are secreted fairly consistently throughout the lifetime of the male on a fairly consistent intervals, whereas in females these will change, and these will change with the cycles. And so this is one of the main things that testosterone does in terms of programming the hypothalamus in order to secrete the hormones at the right frequencies and times. So this, of course, is going to affect sexual behaviors and sexual drives.